All right. Good morning, everybody. How are we doing this morning?
Good morning.
Good morning. Happy Thursday. Is it Thursday? We all have so much. I know all of you have so much going on. I know this class isn't the only thing you have going on. This class is not the only thing I have going on either. And just some days it's hard to like, what day is this in this new existence? Particularly if you work from home like I do, makes it challenging sometimes, makes it challenging. Oh, all right, well, let's see. We're making our way through the plant kingdom. I guess I will share my screen. Share this. We'll make this big. Come on, okay. All right, and then I think I figured out the way to, when I record this, it looks better than the first ones when there are all those heads on the side. Learning curve here, learning curve. Okay. Hopefully everybody can see the slide. And if you can't, let me know. Yeah, so today we're going to start talking about some of the vascular plants. We finally have gotten to the vascular plants. And so in particular, we're going to talk today about plants called lycopods. And we'll talk a little bit about what lycopods are like, what they look like, the evolution or evolutionary history of the lycopods. And then this is one of the major core concepts of the course, which is this thing called heterosperi, which we'll say many, many times, as you know by now, and being in this class, when we see a long, scary word, we repeat it many, many times. So there's no reason to be scared. Let's get in. Just a reminder. So I spoke with the instructor, Dr. Bruna, who is running the lab, and she was very happy with how things went last week, considering it was the first time that you guys were doing the virtual lab. So we discussed it, and so you guys all have lab tomorrow. You'll be doing the liverworts and the hornworts, which now are what, old news, right? Ancient history, because you are so familiar with them. Lab should be pretty easy. Sorry, I'm just trying to mute somebody. Hopefully I'm not muted. No, I'm not. Okay. Yeah, that would be bad. Yeah, so you'll have that tomorrow. Remember to use your respective Zoom links that I sent out for each section, and just make sure you, before you go to lab, that you read through the lab. Read through the lab. The reason why is because there are certain objectives that the labs are wanting you to achieve. The labs and the lecture content are very similar. They go together. They go together. And so the learning objectives of the lab are going to be kind of hitting home some of the things that I really want you to get from the class in general, right? From lecture and in lab. So please read through the lab before you go to lab. It'll save time and also make lab kind of run more smoothly, especially in this virtual format. And the other thing is there's going to always be a couple word banks in a lab. So you should go into lab having an idea of what those words are. Most of the words, if not 95% of the words, we would have already covered in lecture. But if there's any oddballs there that we haven't, go to the glossary in the free textbook that's on Blackboard and look them up, okay? Just so you go in having an idea of what those words are. And lab attendance is important. Lab attendance and lecture attendance collectively are worth 5% of your grade. And let's be honest, 5% isn't going to make or break a bank, right? Like 5% is you could miss class occasionally and it wouldn't do anything to your grade because there's so many classes and it's 5%. But the problem is that, and I used to actually show this to students in a graph after we've had several classes, is understanding the content. So yes, lab and lecture attendance is important in that, it's worth total of 5% of your grade. But more importantly, when you come to lecture and when you go to lab, you are exposed to the conversation, you're exposed to the content, you learn the material more easily, and it's reflected in your assignment performance and especially in your exam performance. So that's why it's important to come to lecture, and that's why it's important to go to lab. All right, enough of that. Enough scolding. Okay, last class we finished up last class we introduced the vascular plants and switch from non-vascular plants to vascular plants. And we talked about some tissues and some growth, which is not my favorite part of the class, but it is a part that we have to cover. And then we kind of briefly talked about the phyla of these early vascular plants, right? Including some that are extinct that we no longer have, but then some that are extant, which means it's still around. All right. Today, yeah, I already said what we're going to do today, but in particular, I want to highlight these terms, Homaspury and Heterosperi, which are core concepts of the course. And so we're going to really talk about that today. All right, here's our roadmap, right? Already in the vascular plants. Now we are in the spore plants, officially in the spore plants of the vascular plants, which includes ferns, lycopods, and horsetails. And today we're going to talk about the lycopods, or sometimes your book might say the lycophytes, or even the lab might say lycophytes. Lycophytes and lycopods are the same thing. And they are the plants that are in the phylum Licorpodiophyta, remember, right? When you see phyta at the end, you know you're talking about a phylum. And the way you pronounce that phylum name is Licopodiophyta. Licopodiophyta. It's actually pretty fun to say if you say it fast. Licopodiophyta. And this is what they look like, right? This is what they look like. I will admit, even as a botanist, I will admit these look kind of mossy. I'm not gonna lie. With the naked eye, they do, especially that one on the bottom left, right? That looks pretty mossy, but they're not mosses. In fact, the ones on the top are from the genus Legopodium, which is nicely named after the whole phylum name. And then the ones on the bottom are from the genus Celaginella, and you can see the pronunciations right there. Both of which are in the lycopods. So Lycopodium is a type of lycopod, Celaginella is a type of lycopod. That will be useful to keep in mind, because sometimes when people talk about lycopods, because Lycopodium has that name, Lycopodium, people sometimes think that's the only lycopod. No, Celaginella, Lycopodium, Celaginella, both lycopods, both of them. All right. Lycopod is a weird word. It's a funny word. It comes from the Greek word lukos, which means wolf, and pous, which means foot. So that means that whoever described lycopods for the first time thought that this looks like a wolf's foot, And these are the oldest surviving phylum of vascular plants. The oldest. So of all the plants that have existed and come and gone, these are the ones that have stayed, the vascular plants, and they're the oldest vascular plants that are still living on Earth. Yeah. And yep, okay, millions of years ago, right? They showed up about 400 million years ago, but they really exploded during the Carboniferous period. So, so lycopods really dominated that time on Earth, and were very, very prevalent during the Carboniferous. And yeah, so wolf's foot, I don't know. I mean, I guess sort of. Even though this is the oldest surviving phylum of vascular plants, there's not that many species in this phylum. There's not that many. There's about 1,000, maybe 1,200, give or take. And many, 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 many extinct species that are no longer here. And because we're in the vascular plants, we already know that the sporophyte generation is the dominant generation. So lycopods, wolf's foot. Okay, yeah, I mean, I guess sort of. I don't know if I would have gone there. But sure. I also haven't looked at that many wolves' feet, but sure, why not? Carboniferous period, what is it? It's a time. And as some of you, hopefully most of you know, the continents that are on Earth are all on different continental shelves, and so they can like move around, and they have moved around over geological time. I have a question here in the chat box. Are Lycopods the class? Do you mean, Brittany, do you mean class like kingdom, phylum, order, class kind of class? Is that what you mean by the,
Yes.
Yeah, okay, cool. No, so Lycopods are the common name of the phylum. So Licopodiophyta, here I'll write it, Licopodiophyta. Licopodiophyta is the name of the phylum, and because Licopodiophyta is kind of like a mouthful, the nickname or the common name of the phylum is Lycopods.
Thank you so much.
No problem. So Carboniferous. So continents, they move around. They're still moving around today. And but back in the Carboniferous, this is kind of what the continents looked like. You can see in the middle, like there's North America, Britain and Ireland and Europe are kind of smushed along the equator. And then closer to the South Pole, you have Africa, India, Australia, South America, all smushed around. Looks very different than how it looks like today. And what I want you to take from this is that look at how much land mass is actually at the equator, right? A lot. And so what that can cause is very, very warm conditions for a lot of the land. So in this map, they're showing you two major continents during the Carboniferous period. You have Gondwana, which is the area toward the South Pole, the one that has in it like India, Africa, South America. And a lot of that subcontinent is covered in ice. Because of that, it made the sea levels get very low because so much ice was held at on that land mass near the South Pole. Instead of being in the ocean, right? It was held up in ice. And then the other subcontinent, this Euramerica kind of subcontinent, is what I was saying before, is located at the equator. And so those regions, those land masses are going to have very tropical or subtropical conditions. And here's what maybe this might have looked like. This is a reconstruction. Obviously, nobody was there to like take selfies during the Carboniferous, right? No. We have to use the fossil record and reconstructions to kind of have an idea of what we think it looked like. And so here is an example of one of those reconstructions. And what happened is that you have low sea levels and a lot of the not ice covered lands, very tropical. And so these, if you have a low sea level, exposes more of the continent itself, right? It's like the sea level goes down. And what happened is that those areas near the equator had a lot of these kind of like what we were saying, shallow seas or not deep seas, but particularly swamps. And in these swamps and shallow seas, and they had these tropical conditions. And so plants were able to grow year round, which is allowing them to basically acquire resources all year long, instead of just in like the spring and the summer, like we have in our regions. And the plants that grew in these swamps are actually pretty much the main things that contribute to fossil fuels today. So I don't know if you remember in the first class, I was saying like, when you think about fossil fuels, you might think of like the dinosaurs, right? And yeah, sure, okay, like there's probably a T-Rex or two in some of the fossil fuels, but most of the fossil fuels, that's just a funny image to have, are from plants. There were way more plants 300 plus million years ago than there were animals. There's way more plants right now than there are animals on Earth, right? So it's plants that are the fossil fuels, and a lot of the fossil fuels that we use today were actually created from these plants dying more than 300 million years ago. If you want to learn more about that, there's a section in the textbook on page 400 kind of talks about this process. But I should just highlight, this is part of the reason why, like, ultimately we kind of need to go away from fossil fuel resources, because these resources were made, you know, over evolutionary time, but in particular because of events that happened hundreds of millions of years ago. And so we can't make more very quickly. So we're going to have to think of and rely on other things going forward, because eventually they will run out, or at least the ones we can access will run out, like get access to. So just so you know, Okay, and then so what were these plants that were in those Carboniferous swamp forests, right? And they were the Lycopods, which we'll talk about today, which are in the phylum Licopodiophyta, right, Brittany? And horsetails, which we will talk about next class, ferns, which we'll talk about the class after that, and then gymnosperms, which we'll talk about the class after that. And so this is what were in that Carboniferous swamp forest, and hence what makes our fossil fuels today. Oh yes, and so there's this extinct lycopod tree, which was the most common plant in these forests based on the fossil record. And at the end of this lecture, we'll talk about this extinct lycopod tree just a little bit. All right, so we're in the phylum Licopodiophyta, right? The lycopods. And I told you there's like maybe 1,000, 1,200 species total, right? Well, most of those species are in these two genera, the genus Legopodium, which I mentioned at the top of the class, and the genus Celaginella. Or some people like to say Celaginella, but I like to say Celaginella. Lycopodium, all right, well, that genus has about 400 species, and there's, you know, we say it has 400 species, and we say that it's the genus Lycopodium, but there is a lot of discussion, I guess you could say, in people who study these plants, who think that maybe Lycopodium should be divided up into lots of different genera. But it's kind of a gray area, and there's no consensus. So maybe it's just one genus, Lycopodium. Maybe it should be divided up into maybe like 10 or 15 genera. The jury is out. So for the purposes of this class, we consider Lycopodium just one genus because it hasn't officially been divided up completely yet. And then Celaginella or Celaginella, which has a lot more species. Both of the species in Lycopodium and Celaginella are tropical, most of them, and they can be terrestrial or grow on land, or epiphytic, which means what? If you're an epiphyte, what does that mean? It means you like to fight, right? Epiphyte. No. Grows on other plants. Yes, grows on other plants. Yep, so those are the ways that they grow. So here's examples. So on the left, you see these things kind of poking out of the ground. That's an example of a terrestrial growth habit. And then on the right, you could see these are growing off this large tree. So that's an example of an epiphytic growth habit. I will say, just briefly, the image on the left, I took that image. And the reason I took that image was because I was walking in the forest one time and I saw it almost It almost looked like somebody had taken like a Christmas tree and buried it under the ground, and only a little bit of it was poking out. And I had this was years ago, and I had no idea what was going on and why somebody would do that or what this was. So I took pictures, and then I ended up encountering it over and over again during my work that day. And then later found out that that was actually a type of Lycopodium coming out of the ground. But it really stopped me in my tracks that day. I was like, why would somebody do that? It's like still green. Yeah, just fun little side story. Okay, and then Celaginella also can have this terrestrial, which you see on the left, or epiphytic growth habit. You can see how much of this branch is covered with all this Celaginella. Okay, so general characteristics of Licopodiophyta. Some of these are going to be things that we can predict already, because we've had this class enough now. Some of these should not be surprising anymore. For example, well, Licopodiophyta is an example of vascular plants. So we know sporophyte generation is dominant, right? And because the sporophytes are vascular, we know that they have true roots, true stems, and true leaves. We already can guess that. But now we have a new thing to kind of consider. And so this is with the Sporangia and the spores. So sometimes, for example, in Lycopodium, you have Homosporous spores. What that means is that when you think homosporous, so homo means same, and then sporous refers to spore. So homosporous is basically saying like the same spores. So it's almost like a spore is a spore is a spore is a spore. You can't really compare them. They're all the same. They just look homogeneous, right? Or homosporous, as is the case here. So some species have homosporous spores, or that means they bear spores that are all the exact same size, and you can't differentiate them on that species. However, other species like Celaginella have what are called Heterosporous spores. So hetero means different, sporous still refers to spore. So that means that on one single plant, there will be spores produced that are different from each other, different sizes and different contents inside as well. We'll talk about that as we go forward today. But think of it this way. So when we talked about the non-vascular plants, when we talked about spore in those plants, we never said anything special about those spores. They were just spores. We just said spores, right? And that's because those non-vascular plants also have homosporous spores. And in general, homosporous spores produce bisexual gametophytes. So meaning homosporous spores grow into gametophytes that have both male and female sex organs on the same plant, on one plant. So if you have both sex organs growing on one plant, we might call that one plant, both sex organs, monoecious. Yes, thank you, monoecious, exactly. So homosporous spores produce monoecious or bisexual gametophytes, whereas heterosporous spores produce unisexual gametophytes or dioecious gametophytes, right? Oh, well, there you go. So when you're looking, well, I kind of did that, I guess. When you have the slides, at least you know that that's how I want you thinking, right? That's how I want you thinking. Kind of like putting all these terms together into some jigsaw puzzle masterpiece, right? Okay. Growth, okay, growth. So we're going to talk a little bit about this concept of dichotomy. It's come up before. I haven't spent that much time on it before because it really didn't matter so much back then, because in the non-vascular plants, growth is pretty simple anyways. And so most things have this thing of like dichotomy. And remember, I think I said it last time. You see this term dichotomy, you should think of like grow, split, right? That's kind of what that means. And so in lycopods, right? So Lycopodium and Celaginella, if you have that grow, split growth pattern, we call that equal dichotomy, grow, split. And that is the more primitive, or you could say ancestral trait, right? That's the more basal level trait, is equal dichotomy. And just because I have an opportunity to annotate here, so look, here we go, grow, split, right? Split, grow, split, equal, split. So we call that equal dichotomy. So that's the more primitive or basal state, right? Like the more early state. However, later plants have a more advanced, I guess you could say, or a more modern state, which is this unequal dichotomy. So it's kind of like, I guess a good place to highlight that here would be like down here. So like a grow, split, this split goes on to becoming like this whole thing, whereas this split just kind of keeps going straight for a while. There'll be other pictures of this that it might be a little more clear. Sometimes it could be a little hard to see, but just trust me, it's not as equal as like what's shown over here. Like I said, there'll be more clear pictures, I think, on subsequent slides. So equal is the more primitive state, unequal is the more advanced state. And just as a stylistic thing, just there's no buds yet. We will talk about buds later. So these don't have real branches. So they're still relatively simple plants. Don't worry too much about that. So here's that thing again. Remember I said in the lycopods, you have the equal and then unequal. Some also have a combination of both. So for example, Celaginella, a lot of its species can have equal and unequal dichotomy on the same plant. And I guess that would be kind of probably more advanced, even more advanced than just unequal. We talked about some of these things last time, right? So the stems have an epidermis, a cortex, and a protostele. Remember we said the protostele from last time is that solid cylinder of xylem and phloem. The the lycopods also have microphylls, which we talked about last time, right? A small leaf with a single vein. And they have adventitious roots, which means roots that grow off the stem. Where are the sporangia? Well, as we talked about last time toward the end of the lecture, now we're in the vascular plants, and now the sporangia is located on leaves. So in the mosses, for example, and the other plants we looked at, a lot of times the sporangia were elevated on a seta, right? Like in the mosses, it was on a seta. In the true mosses, it was on a seta. In the liverworts, it was on a seta. On the hornworts, it didn't have a seta because it had that weird intercalary meristem thing. And in the peat mosses, it didn't no seta anymore either because we had that weird pseudopodium thing. But now we're in the vascular plants, and now we're in the lycopods, and the sporangia are now located on leaves. Sporangia are located on leaves, Where are the sporangia located on the lycopods? On leaves. What are those leaves called? Sporophylls. Make a note of that, please. On leaves, aka sporophylls. Oh, this is a good example This is a good example here of like how Blackboard isn't perfect at grading. So like, I think you guys saw the email I sent out because I was getting a lot of emails about why did my grade change? And so I figured we'll just send that out once and for all so you guys finally can understand, even though I've talked about it in lecture several times. So this is a good example. Let's say I have a question that asks about Sporangia. Where are they? Where are they, right? And I happen to be asking you about lycopods. And I said, where are they located? And you wrote on sporophylls, right? That's correct. But maybe you wrote on leaves. That is also correct. And there's no way for me to tell Blackboard to accept both those things. So that's why I go in manually after it's submitted to read and look at your actual responses and read what you wrote and give you credit where credit is due, etc. And also take away points when they are not earned. That's also going to happen. Sorry about that. It's just the way we are in here. Normally I'd be giving you a piece of paper, you would take the assignment, I'd take it home and I'd grade it and I give it back to you, but we're not there right now. Okay, where are the sporangia located on the lycopods? On leaves, aka sporophylls. Sometimes the sporophylls of the lycopods are what's called born singly. Born singly. What that means is on its own. Like, here it is, one sporophyll by itself. Here's another one, born singly. Here's another one, not organized. One, not organized. And being born singly is the more primitive state or ancestral state. However, sometimes the sporophylls are organized, and they're organized into a structure called a Strobilus, and that is the more advanced trait. Sometimes the sporophylls are photosynthetic, as we talked about last time. Sometimes they're not. Usually the ones that are born singly or on their own are photosynthetic. Usually the ones that are in a Strobilus are not. Last but not least, in terms of these kind of structures, this Strobilus thing. A Strobilus, again, remember here, just because it's kind of a newish term. Where's my pen? Here. Look, organized into a Strobilus, right? The Strobilus itself sometimes is what's called sessile, which is another way of saying does not have a stalk. And sometimes it is elevated by a stalk, which we call a peduncle. We will see pictures of this on the subsequent slides, but I'm just showing you this in a summary slide so you have the terms. Sessile or not elevated is the more primitive state. Elevated on a peduncle is the more advanced or modern trait or state. Okay. That's, yes, well, that's always, thanks me. I mean, like, that's always the case, right? So in the sporangia, you have the spore mother cells, AKA sporocytes, AKA sporogenous cells, whatever, that are 2 or diploid 2N that undergo meiosis and produce spores that are haploid, right? We already know that, but just, I guess, as a reminder. All right. So now we're going to look at the two, each genus, and we'll look at some of those terms that we just learned will come up in these slides. So look here. So this is a species called Lycopodium lucidulum, right? If you look at the map on the left, shows you where they occur naturally. And if you're looking at this plant, you can note some things that we just talked about and determine whether or not this is more of a basal state Lycopodium or a primitive Lycopodium, or if it's a later, more modern and advanced, I guess, Lycopodium. So first of all, it has equal dichotomy, right? Grow, split, right? So that we know is primitive quality. Sporophylls are photosynthetic and born singly, which is what I said before, right? There's no Strobilus here. Here's a close-up. Oops, get away from there. Here's a close-up of the top of one of these down here. And you can see here's one sporophyll. Here's one sporophyll. Not organized, just growing. So that's the born singly part, born singly. And they're green, which means they are photosynthetic, right? So taken together, this Lycopodium is relatively of a more primitive, right, in evolutionary time. Here's another one, Lycopodium anotinum. You can see the map there showing where it's normally found. Here now we have unequal dichotomy, which is a little bit more advanced. And we have strobili, or singular is Strobilus. So here is one Strobilus. Strobilus is an organization of all of the sporophylls, right? And in the case here, these sporophylls are non-photosynthetic. Normally, if you're a sporophyll that's in a Strobilus, right? Remember, this thing here is a Strobilus, and all of these things on it, you can't really draw them because they're so small, are the sporophylls. Normally, if you're a sporophyll organized into a Strobilus, you're usually not photosynthetic. That's kind of how that's like a trade-off. In order to be organized on a Strobilus, you have to be super, super small. And so things like undergoing photosynthesis kind of aren't important as much anymore in those. And it will be the other leaves, right, that are just regular microphylls that do the photosynthesis. I got something in the chat box. Oh, I thought club mosses were some type of moss. LOL. Now I know better. Yeah, trust me. That's why these common names can be deceptive, right? But for what it's worth, with just walking through the forest or wherever and you saw club mosses, they look kind of mossy. So it's understandable. Yeah, so that's up here, one Strobilus. Down here, look at all of these strobili. That's the plural. Here's one here, here's one here, here's one here, right? All these strobili. And in the case of this Lycopodium anotinum, there is no peduncle. Look, this Strobilus here, remember, this is a Strobilus, is not elevated on any stalk. It's just sessile right here, just attached to the stem, like not elevated on any special little stalk. So in terms of advanced versus primitive, here we have unequal dichotomy, we have a Strobilus and no peduncle. So we could say that this one is more advanced than the one we just saw, right? But it doesn't have a peduncle, so it's not as advanced as it could be yet in terms of morphological form. Here we go. And here's another example. So look, flabelliforme, fun to say, Lycopodium flabelliforme. Here now we have equal and unequal dichotomy. We have strobili again. But we also have the strobili elevated by special stalks called a peduncle. Peduncle will also show up in other phylum later in the course, just so you know. It's not a one and done term. It'll show up again. So look, here is one Strobilus. Here is another Strobilus. Look at all these strobili, and they're elevated on a special stalk, right? Here is the strobili. Whoa. Getting excited. Here's all the strobili. And here is that special stalk called the peduncle, right? So in terms of advanced versus primitive, we can say that this flabelliforme Lycopodium, right? Lycopodium flabelliforme, well, has unequal and equal dichotomy. It has strobili, it has peduncles. So of the three that we just saw, this being the third, you could say that this one has the most advanced of the qualities that there are to have in the Lycopods, right? Okay. Homosporous, right, here we go. Okay, all right. So remember that the sporophyte plant makes spores, right? Sporophyte. Phyte is a plant. Plant that makes what? Spores. Sporophyte. So if you're a sporophyte plant, you're making spores. Now we know from the beginning of this class that sometimes, depending on your species, you can make one spore type or two spore types. Well, for Lycopodium makes Homosporous spores, one spore type. And so we say the sporophytes, the Lycopodium sporophytes are homosporous, which means they only have one spore type, just like all the other plants we looked at so far in the course. And just like all the other plants we looked at, hold on. God, every time I feel like I'm going to sneeze in class, it just doesn't come. I was so ready to have it come. Lycopodium, Homosporous spores, one spore type, right? One spore type. When you have a single type of spore, it's like we've already talked about, right? Like, so when you have one spore type, when the spore lands on the ground, it's going to germinate and grow into a gametophyte plant. And in other words, when the gametophyte plant grows from that spore, when there's one spore type and the gametophyte plant grows from that one spore, it grows outside of the spore wall. So we say that the gametophyte is exosporic. Exo means outside of, and sporic refers to spore. So the gametophyte grows outside of the spore. So it emerges outside of the spore, right? And looks like a little green blob that we've already talked about in this course. So just because these terms are a little new, I just want to kind of double down on this. When the sporophyte plants make one type of spore, we say the sporophytes are homosporous. The gametophytes that grow out of that one type of spore, they grow literally out of it. They grow literally out of it. So they grow outside of the spore. Gametophyte grows outside of the spore. Gametophyte is exosporic. Got a question in the chat box. Are they usually multiple strobili attached to a peduncle? Sometimes. So on that previous slide, we saw, oops. Right, we had these as examples. Right here, like this one has multiple strobili on one peduncle. Sometimes that is the case, but you do have cases where it might be a single strobilus on one peduncle. And if you had a single strobilus on one peduncle, that would be a more primitive quality than if you had lots of strobili on one peduncle. No problem. All right. Homosporous Sporophyte has one type of spore. Gametophyte grows out of that spore and is called exosporic. And in the case of these lycopods, the gametophyte that grows out is small. The gametophyte that grows out is non-vascular because it's basically a little green blob. Has rhizoids, so it's still kind of those qualities that we are used to. And if you have, remember I said this at the top of the class, if you have one spore type, one spore type, not only is the gametophyte exosporic, meaning it grows outside of the spore wall, just like all the other plants we've seen so far in the class, but also the gametophyte of a single, when you have one spore type, is bisexual or monoecious, right? Because the reason why is a spore is a spore is a spore. Like if there's no differentiation, every spore just grows, and every spore that grows into a gametophyte plant has male and female sex organs on it in the lycopods. But you might be looking at the slide and thinking, what is this like kind of almost looks like a radish or something? Sometimes in Lycopodium, you could have these different, depending on the species. Sometimes the gametophyte plant will look like the one on the left, which is this like green blob photosynthetic gametophyte. But other species of Lycopodium have a gametophyte that almost looks like a little turnip or a radish or something like that. Kind of looks like that. Mainly, it's not green. It almost doesn't look like a plant. It kind of just looks like this thing. And that's a non-photosynthetic gametophyte plant. Oh, don't worry about that. Basically, all that's saying is that little green blob type of gametophyte is photosynthetic and grows on the surface of the soil. And that makes sense because it needs to be exposed to sun because it does photosynthesis. But the turnipy looking one, radishy looking one, from certain species of lycopods, it grows underneath the ground. And that's what these are showing you. Don't worry, I don't care about that. All right, I do care about this though. So lots of gametophytes of Lycopodium have a symbiotic relationship with a fungus or fungi. And here we could talk about it. Let me move this. So symbiotic relationship with fungi, mycorrhizal fungi. This might be something you remember from the documentary, right? With the Douglas fir trees, mycorrhizal fungi. And so lots of gametophytes in Lycopodium have this relationship. And these mycorrhizae are very common in the plant world, and they do associate with a lot of plants, but a lot of the Lycopodium have this relationship with the gametophytes. And some plants can't actually live without it, particularly these ones, these gametophytes, particularly these are non-photosynthetic. It cannot make its own food. So it needs to get food from somewhere, and it gets food from these fungi. So the fungi receive glucose from the plant roots, right? So of mature lycopods, they receive glucose from those, and in turn, the gametophyte plants will also get glucose from them. Don't worry about that. Just know that some species can't live without this symbiotic relationship, and that things that get transferred are the fungi receive sugars from the plant roots, or glucose or carbon, all the same thing. And the plants receive water and minerals from the fungi, right? Plants receive water and mineral from the fungi, including the gametophyte plants. This is just showing you the red circle is a cross section, and inside of that cross section of a gametophyte plant is triangles, and they're showing you this right here, this purpley stuff. That is the fungi that's inside of the gametophyte plant, providing it minerals and nutrients. And then this is just a close-up of what that fungi looks like inside of the gametophyte plant. It stains like a purple color. Okay. Interestingly, this might look familiar from the last class. We know that this symbiotic relationship has been going on for a really long time, because you might recall this this plant we saw last time, which is an extinct early vascular plant. Well, look, in some of the fossilized specimens of this, we've actually seen these fungal hyphae, don't worry about that, but these fungal filaments in the fossils of these plants. This has been going on a long time. All right. Gonna try to get through some of this today so we can be doing good with time. So let's go through, not super long, but let's go through the alternation of generations for Lycopodium, right? Which is a type of lycopod. So here we go. Here. I'll switch colors to orange. All right, so we'll start here. Look, gametophyte plant, right? In the case of this gametophyte plant, it's one of those kind of turnipy looking radishy ones. The egg and sperm have already fertilized and have already gone through fertilization. And so now we had the zygote, we had the embryo, and now we already have the mature sporophyte plant growing out of where the egg was, right, which was in the gametophyte plant. This mature sporophyte, is covered in leaves. These leaves are called microphylls because they are simple and have one vein. In the case of this species, which is just a representative species, some of the microphylls contain spores, sporangia on them, which are called sporophylls. And in the case of this one, they're organized in the Strobilus, right, or many strobili up here. And this species also has the strobili elevated on a stalk, which we call peduncle, right? Okay. If we were to do close up on the top of one of these Strobilus, and you looked up close, you would see the different leaves that bear sporangia. Here's one, here's one, here's one, right? And if we were to do a close up of a sporangia, which is right here, here we see a single sporangium, right? And inside of the sporangium, there's going to be where those spore mother cells are that are 2N, right? Or sporogenous cells or sporocytes, whichever you like. A sporophyll. Here is a sporophyll underneath the microscope, right? You can see this is on the left, it's zoomed in, and on the right, it's even more zoomed in. Here is the sporophyll attached. There's another one attached to the Strobilus. We were to do close up of one of these. Here you go again. This is just one sporophyll, right? A leaf that bears a sporangium. Here's the sporangium, right? Look at all the spores inside. Okay. Yes. All right. So this is where we left off in the previous. We have the sporangium with the 2N sporogenous cells inside. Meiosis is going to occur, which the result is going to be those spores that are haploid. Eventually, once that occurs, the sporangium will rupture and open, and the spores will be released. Here's one spore. The spore is released. Notice, one type of spore is released. One type of spore is released because the sporophyte plant of Lycopodium is Homosporous. So only one type of spore is released. That means we know that the gametophyte plant that's going to grow out. So look, see this little thing here, down here, that little darker spot? That's the spore wall. Here, look, let me move this. See this here? Look, this is a spore that's opening. And this part here that's coming out is the gametophyte plant. Here's the spore again. And now this whole thing is the gametophyte plant. So the gametophyte plant is growing out of the spore wall, So it's exosporic, right? Exo means out of, the spore, sporic, exosporic. And so we know already from earlier in this class, then it must be bisexual or monoecious. And so it does indeed have both male and female sex organs on one gametophyte plant. And then once we get to the sex organ part, we know what's going to happen, right? Inside of an archegonium, you have an egg. Sperm from the antheridium is going to swim swim? Doesn't swim, I think it does swim. Hold on, let's see. We'll see on the next slide. Oh, and just so when you're looking at these later on your own, these are some reminders, right? Spore is homosporous, right? Because the sporophyte is homosporous. Gametophyte grows outside of the spore wall. Gametophyte is bisexual or monoecious. Okay. Oh yeah, we swim. That's right. Look at these guys swim. All right. So yes. So in the Lycopodium, we do probably still need water, therefore, for the sperm to swim in this case. But in general, in the non-vascular plant, sorry, in general in the vascular plants, that's no longer the case. But here it is the case. So we do need water to swim. But check it out. Here they go. Here's the sperm leaving. This here is a close-up of a sperm. The sperm is going to swim, 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 meet the egg, and then fertilization occurs. The result is a 2N zygote, right? We're kind of used to that already. All right, so that is the alternation of generations in a Lycopodium, right? Let's talk a little bit about Celaginella. I know we're getting close to getting antsy and wanting to leave, but I think we can get through this today and then we'll be in really good shape. So let's try. I don't think there's not as much here as there were for the other part. So this is talking about those traits again. Notice that this Celaginella has both equal and unequal dichotomy, right? So it's kind of more advanced. And in the case here, the strobili of Celaginella in this species, the sporophylls are photosynthetic, but in this case, they're also arranged in a strobili, but the Strobilus is less obvious. So like this is a Strobilus, here are two strobili. It's not as obvious as it is in the Lycopods, in the Lycopodium. This will show you here. So like, look, this is a close-up. Here, let's change colors. This is a close-up of one Strobilus. And as you can see, it kind of still looks like leafy. Doesn't look as different like the Strobilus looked in Lycopodium. So in other words, like each of these tips is a Strobilus, but it doesn't really look like it. It just kind of looks not. Okay. This is cool. So here's another example of Celaginella. This is one, you actually can buy this as a plant. It's called Resurrection Plant. Sometimes it's sold as a fern. They'll say Resurrection Fern. It's not a fern. It's actually Celaginella, a lycopod. Again, you have equal and unequal dichotomy, so that's kind of more advanced. Same idea as before, like the strobili are they don't look as much like a different. They kind of look like the rest of the leaves, but they are in technical terms still a strobili. But this is cool. I want to show you this. I'm going to show you this. So this plant, while I pull this up, this plant's called Resurrection Plant because you can, I got to share this. This plant lives in the desert. And let me pull it up. Yes, this plant lives in the desert, and so it can be completely dried up, like completely dried up for a long time, years and years and years. And then when water comes, can you guys see the video? If you can't, let me know. It should be showing now. If you put it in water, or if water comes in the desert, this is time lapse, but this is only over like a 20 or 30-minute time period. But check it out. It resurrects. It goes from looking completely dead and dry to basically emerging and being completely green and ready to continue its life cycle. And so you could actually buy these. They're fun. You can throw them in a bowl of water and watch them resurrect. Resurrection Plant, super cool thing. And let me just pull this back up. Yeah, super, super cool. Resurrection Plant, which is here. So you can see here this before and after is showing you what happens when this plant's exposed to water. Pretty cool. All right, and so we do have to talk a little bit about this heterosporous thing, right? So all the plants we've looked at so far in this course have been homosporous, meaning the sporophytes only produce one type of spore. But Celaginella is heterosporous, meaning that it produces two types of spores. And when you have two types of spores, you have microspores and megaspores. And now some distinctions are, if you have two types of spores, microspores and megaspores, now the gametophyte plants are going to stay inside of the spore walls, inside of the spore walls. Endo means in, sporic means spores. Gametophytes are going to grow, stay inside of, and grow inside of the spore walls. Yeah, this is a new concept. It's a new concept for us. Remember when we first came across this term micro, I told you, like for the microphyll, that in the case of the microphyll, it means like a small leaf with a single vein. But every other time in this class, every other time, except for microphyll, every other time that we see the prefix micro in this class, it refers to male. And anytime we see mega in this class, it refers to female. The reason why is in the plant world, male things tend to be very small compared to the female things. I mean, that's also the case in the mammals, right? One sperm is very small compared to one egg, right? But in the plant world, we use micro to refer to male things and mega to refer to female things simply because of size. And the male gametophyte plants will grow inside of the microspores. And the female gametophyte plants, yep, you guessed it, grow inside of the megaspores. So this concept of two types of spores is different than we're used to having so far. Look, here's that size thing I was just talking about. So on the left, you see a diagram. This is not a diagram. This is a microscope picture. Those little dots are microspores, each of which has a male gametophyte plant inside of it. And that big circle is a megaspore that has one female gametophyte plant inside of it. So you can see the micro versus the mega, right? You can see it there. So before, when we had one spore type, the gametophyte plants were bisexual, right? Monoecious. Well, here, look, we know that they're inside of these spores. We know they're inside of these spores. We know that the male gametophyte plant is inside of a microspore, inside of that. We know the female gametophyte plant is inside a megaspore. So we know they have to be in two houses. They're in two spore houses in this case. So each one therefore is unisexual, or as we like to say in the botany, dioecious for the gametophytes. And that bigger female gametophyte, you know, in that bigger megaspore is going to have on her stuff we're already used to, the archegonia. So if I were to just show you this here, so this is the spore wall, kind of looks like dinosaur scales, spore wall. And then this stuff in here is a gametophyte plant, the female gametophyte plant she has on her archegonia. And she stays inside of that spore wall. She does not come out. She stays inside. She pokes out a little bit, just to be like, hey, but she stays inside. She stays inside. And then here you go. That's the male gametophyte plant. I'll use the same colors as I did before. Here is the microspore wall. The microspore wall. And inside of that microspore wall is the male gametophyte, which now is literally reduced to a single antheridium. So the male gametophyte plant now consists only of a single antheridium. And as Dr. Casper, who taught this class before me, used to always say, it's kind of like testicles in space, because each male gametophyte plant now is basically like one testicle, and it's inside of a microspore. And that's why that's why the microspore can be so small, because all the male gametophyte has now is one antheridium. All right, yep, we have time to do this. We're almost done. This is the Celaginella alternation of generations. In terms of the players, like Strobilus or Microphyll or Sporophyte and Gametophyte, like those things are the same, but there are a few differences here because of this microspore megaspore thing. So let's go through it. Use a different color. I'll use blue. Okay. Here is the megaspore wall. What did the megaspore have inside of it? A female gametophyte plant. And she had an egg, which has apparently already been fertilized, because now we see the young sporophyte plant already emerging. Eventually, the sporophyte plant will be mature and the gametophyte plant won't be attached to it anymore. And then on this sporophyte plant, we have Strobilus, which is basically leaves on it that each leaf has on it a sporangium. So if we look at one Strobilus and look at it up close, so this is one Strobilus that we're looking up close, you will see different types of sporangia, because there's two spore types now. We'll see one sporangia that has megaspores inside, and we see one sporangia here that has microspores inside. Because this sporangia has megaspores inside, we can call it a megasporangium. Because this sporangium has microspores inside, here's another one up here, we can call it a microsporangium. Oh, here it says microspores up here. I didn't see that because my annotation thing's in the way. And because we love naming things in the plant world, because this sporangium has megaspores inside, we call it a megasporangium. We can call the leaf that it's attached to a megasporophyll. We'll have more of these terms will repeat. I'm just giving them to you today for the first time so they can simmer in your brain. Because this sporangium has microspores inside, and we can call it a microsporangium. We can call this leaf that it's on Microsporophyll. Okay, don't worry about that too much. I'm just getting you used to these terms. Here's what you should worry about for today, though. Outside of the microsporangium emerges microspores. Outside of the megasporangium emerges megaspores. So these are going to be released from those sporangia, just like we're used to. But now we're dealing with two types of spores. This is just so when you're looking at the slides later, that you'll have these terms to look at. Okay. Ligule. What the heck is a ligule? There's one over there. There's one over there. We're not really sure. We're not really sure. It shows up. Basically, ligule is this type of thing where anytime it shows up in the plant world, we're just like, if there's a little green thing that we don't know what it does, we just say, oh, a ligule. That's a ligule. But nobody really knows what it does. It's kind of like a who knows kind of thing. But it shows up a decent amount of times such that we named it. But what it does, we're not sure. My feelings are it's probably leftover from something in the past. So like vestigial, meaning in the past there was something there of importance, but now we just see this little nubby. And it's just a vestigial product of that, kind of like our appendix. Is that the one? I know more about plants than the humans. Okay. Oh, don't worry about that today. Don't worry about that today. Okay. Let's just do this real quick. We're almost done. We're almost done. Hang in there. Hang in there. This is almost done. So here's that microspore. Here is that megaspore, right? Oops. Here's that megaspore. We know that inside of the microspore is the male gametophyte plant. We know that inside of the megaspore is the female gametophyte plant. who sticks out just a little bit to be like, hello. The microspore, so the gametophyte plant inside of the microspore, right? The male gametophyte plant is basically a testicle in space now. It's just one antheridium inside of the microspore. However, the female gametophyte plant, she still has a lot of the same qualities. You know, she's not just an archegonium. She has a plant body and, but then also several archegonia on her. But notice, still inside of that megaspore wall. Microspore sperm will be made inside of the microspore. Eventually, it will be released. Effectively, what happens is the microspore lands on the megaspore, and the sperm can be released. Sperm is going to swim, and meet an egg. And then we already know what happens. Oh yeah, and so this is just for you to have for your slides, right? We have two types of spores now. So we can say that the sporophyte plant and the spores it makes are heterosporous. Gametophytes stay inside of the spore wall, inside endo. They're endosporic. Because they're in two separate spores, they have to be dioecious because they're in two separate houses, two separate spores. The gametophyte plants. Okay. Sperm and egg meet. Fertilization occurs. And now we're going to, the new sporophyte plant will start to grow. Obviously, first it's going to be attached to where the egg was, the female gametophyte plant. And then this is where we started this whole thing just now. So we're back at the beginning. Oh, okay, long class today. I know. Here, this is just a picture showing you. Here's that megaspore. And this is the new sporophyte plant emerging. There's the shoot system, there's the root system. It's just a real picture of what we saw on the diagram before. Yep, and now we're back to the beginning of where we started. All right, this is the last thing we're going to talk about. It's like one slide more, and then we're going to end for the day. But this is important, this significance of heterosphere. That's why we had to kind of get through this today, because this is important. So recall from the previous lectures that we've had the important characteristics of non-vascular plants and vascular plants. They're opposite, right? Non-vascular plants don't have vascular tissue. Vascular plants have vascular tissue. Non-vascular plants have free-living gametophytes. Vascular plants have free-living sporophytes. And non-vascular plants have a reduced sporophyte that has to be attached to the gametophyte. The vascular plants have reduced gametophyte, right? So they're opposite. But notice this reduced gametophyte thing. And during the course of evolutionary time and during the course of this class, this course, we're going to see the gametophyte plant getting more and more and more and more reduced over time, more and more reduced. And this shift to heterosphere is that first step of that. So here you go. This is a great summary slide. These are all the non-vascular plants we looked at. The two top ones are the true mosses. Then you have the peat mosses, underneath that liverworts, and on the very bottom you have the hornworts, right? These are all the plants we looked at so far. And for all of those, the sporophytes only make one type of spore. So they're homosporous. And for all of those, the gametophytes grow outside of the spore wall. Well, that makes sense because the gametophytes are dominant in those, so they need to get big, so they can't stay inside of a spore wall. So they are exosporic. Gametophytes dominant, as I just said, but ultimately we see a reduction in gametophyte size, even in those, right? We went in the mosses, you have a big green fluffy. And then by the time you get to the liverworts, it's kind of like little green tongue thing, right? Thallus. And then when you get to the hornworts, even smaller little green tongue looking thing, thallus. So we still see a decrease in the size of the gametophyte plant. And when we get to the vascular plants that we talked about today, these two, the lycopods, right? Lycopodium and Celaginella. For all of those two, the sporophytes are dominant, but we keep seeing this decrease in size of the gametophyte. That still happens. And this, I can't say this enough. This is a major evolutionary shift for the plants to go from a homosporous existence with gametophytes growing outside of the spore to growing to a heterosporous existence with gametophyte plants staying inside the spore. Because what ends up happening because of this shift over evolutionary time, when you have that shift to heterosporous spores, ultimately this will lead to the seed. This ultimately leads to the seed. So we eat seeds. We eat all the things that we pretty much eat come from seed-bearing plants. So this is a major evolutionary leap. So it's very significant in the evolutionary history of plants. Okay. As we move forward in the course, the significance will become even more clear. Okay. We are not going to talk about the fossil lepidodendron today. We ran out of time. Lepidodendron. And that's fine. We could talk about it next time. It's just a few slides anyways. But I will say instead, next class, we'll talk about that fossil tree, Lepidodendron, but then we'll also do the horsetails and the scouring rushes. We'll talk a little bit about the steel, and we'll talk about this thing called a megaphyll. That will be next time. I want you to know, so in the syllabus originally, assignment 3, which covers this class and the class we had before. So this class is technically lectures 6 and 7. So even though it says covers lectures 6 and 7, it's just this class and the class we had before. That was originally due this coming Tuesday, but because we're only finishing, it's Thursday right now, and because we're only finishing this material today, there's no lepidodendron, like the thing we didn't cover today is not going to be on that assignment. I switched it, and so now that assignment 3 is going to be due on Thursday before class. So 1 week from today, covers material from this class and the previous class, okay? Just to let you know, and that's it. So if anyone has any questions, I am sorry that, well, the class technically does go to 11:20, but normally we finish a little earlier. But yeah, so that's all I have for today. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, either here in the chat box, if you want to just speak out. I have office hours today from noon until 1. I have a few appointments already scheduled for those office hours, but if you want to meet during office hours today, just send me an email and I can send you a different link to use for that. And for those of you that I have meetings with during office hours, I'll see you in a little bit. And I'll sit here for a few minutes in case somebody does have a question that they want to. Thank you guys. Have a great weekend. Have a good lab tomorrow. And I'll just wait a few more minutes while I just relax for a second. Just in case anyone has any questions. Okay. Okay, any questions? Going once. Going twice. It's always interesting to see how many students are still in here, but not responding. Just make a quick note of that. All right.